speaker is Gundaker, who comes to us from the College of William and Mary, and she's going to be speaking about African American commemorative practices.
All right. I'm not exactly going to talk about commemorative practices, but it's sort of part of it is in that ballpark. Cornell West and Eddie Esquad have pointed to a current of pragmatism in African American thought that predates John Dewey and William James, with Black Americans striving for a better world through what James called the will to believe. But believe, to do otherwise, they say, would be to be swamped by oppression. But belief can be misleading if taken as faith in something that isn't real. As Maya Darren explained, Haitian Vodutsi don't serve spirits because they believe in them. They experience them directly. Relationships between matter and spirit are simply real life when one lives among them. So neither romantic or superstitious, I should get over here, nor detached from labor, politics, or the battles looming over the soldiers who sang these spirituals during the Civil War. Representations of the dead partake of this reality, mediating social relations and reinforcing dynamics of transformation and renewal, which I borrowed terms from John Jansen's catalog essay. They fit broad cultural patterns and foundations for a well-lived life, a better future for children, and holding others accountable for these values for the health of the larger community. This accords with Protestant Christian doctrine. However, relationships with those who've passed can also mix with Christianity with what people have called to me the old way that's not in the Bible. This is why, along with disliking mess, neighbors rarely approve of protective figures like these. And I think these and face vessels have something in common. Some are fairly explicit in relating to the dead, especially spirits that hover too close to earth. Others are monster versions of old-time haints and plaid eyes. All signal powers to perceive what's hidden. Their fierceness promises moral enforcement from the wild, or in the U.S., the bushes, an ambivalent zone in the landscape. These figures also veer away from what, in my long experience as a white person, white people do, at least this way. The white people that I know from, my Southern background have their own versions. Moral accountability can also take a very different turn, role modeling how to live. The rhythms of Mrs. Jackie Jones's house, when crack houses emerged on her street, is akin to the music of African Americans in her own church, and an invitation into the safety zone of God's love. Inherited jewelry and tools keep the warmth of those who pass alive. Get PACnet-linked attributes of his late wife together, and he used pop tops from the cans that she strung to actually tie these together as well. He showed her transition to a new being as a small child, rising from her own shoes and wig there in the middle. And he made her a seat in heaven with mirrors, funeral flowers, and the last soda can that she drank from, which is over there on the right. Protective figures and memorials are two trajectories with different semiotic cues. A third, ancestors, uses greater abstraction to represent the dead who have moved beyond their individual names into a more generalized cohort. Joining with other channels, from ring shouts to genealogical societies, I argue that these representations augment and expand and receive Christianity. My research is focused on descendants of enslaved plantation field workers, reiterating an old argument that I think is at least as ideological as it is evidentiary, and coming from Richard Price before that. Ira Berlin contends that Africans enslaved on plantations were too brutalized to keep transatlantic knowledges alive. However, according to Stephen Mintz's figures, by 1860, this population had grown from 8 to 60% of enslaved labor force in the Americas. If a quarter came from West Central Africa, descent and relocation spread resources wider. Cultural processes continually change, but cultural patterns cycle around and renew. When I was 10, Miss Mary Walker, born in slavery, kissed me. Time expands and contracts depending on context. Ancestors are near and also far. Two kinds of flexibility contribute to this. First is scale. People make larger works today because they have property, but they could have achieved a lot of the same goals from taking things or seeing things in their landscape around them. This is shown by enduring terms like Finda and Cindy in South Carolina. Special trees, past and present, attest to this as well. Benny Lusain's four-eyed tree is part of a long line of connections centered on trees, spirits, the dead. So my sort of stance to all of this is that old and new are complementary sides of a both and, with every turn a form of renewal. The second factor is the flexibility of performance. Robert Farris Thompson wrote in 1974, in sub-Saharan Africa, action is a superior mode of thought. Movement serves long-term knowledge, answering to the imperatives of life. Action is a superior mode of thought because performance manifests layered truths as living knowledge in which you are participating. Spoken words lie. Smiles can conceal hostile thoughts. Thus, relying on one sense or one plane of reality makes us prey to deception, and as my catalog essay discusses, even irresponsibility. Now, we will see if this happens. How do you sort of make the thing come up? It should be, okay. Well, what we have here, and I'll just go back, we're supposed to have, but you can find it by typing in buzzard lope, is a dance that, because of its name, is said in Wikipedia still to be part of the minstrel tradition, and funky southern music groups love to call themselves buzzard lope, sorry, you know. But what you have here is John Davis and the Sea Island Singers, with Davis here moving around a handkerchief and acting the part of a buzzer, closing in on the body of an enslaved person which has been dumped. And I think the staticness of this handkerchief, given that they're agitated when the spirit is moving in a black church, the stillness reinforces that. Performance enacts, it draws participants deeply into intellectual and affective dimensions of comprehension. It's easy to forget this when we look at, as distant spectators, at museumized art. Like the performer-audience separation, Euro-oriented categories that, like music, dance, and art, that are kept in departmental units, mask the intersection channels in which knowledge circulates. Here, face like, whoops, come on. Here, face like a looking glass in this prayer couples the affected flatness of death with receding memory. This idea moves through spirituals, which turn the mirror toward the shine of the transformed soul and onto ancestors whose faces take on the bright generality of a coin polished through use. This is one of three main ways of representing ancestors: a round, white, or shining head on a natural wooden post. Unlike Mr. Packnett's memorial, all three of these kinds are usually located in what in somebody's yard would be a kind of miniature sacred forest or near real woods. It's tempting to parse such representations as creolization of wooden markers in the 19th century with figures like Kongo Kiteki. Kiteki contained the captured breath or spirit of an ancestor divined as causing social and physical problems. Certainly, enslavement and injustice would count as problems. But it's worth remembering that when Thompson began publishing, and Jason also brought up this point, on transatlantic origins for arts in the African diaspora, scholars invested in the erasure of the African past, demanded ties to a single origin, and even more narrowly for people like Burleson. By now it's plain that nothing is going to convince these people, so we're free to follow the evidence wherever it leads us. But over these 40 years, new problems have arisen, and I would like to say, if you search my stuff, you'll find I've been guilty of all of them at one time or another. One is using the term folk art in a conflation with the art market category of folk art, where it's just like cheaper stuff than Titian, made by marginalized people whose status you marginalize again through the term. This is not how folklorists use this term. In that connection, we're all folks. We are all in folk groups because we all have stories. Glossing historical gaps as amorphous resonances, or reducing Kongo culture to lookalikes for object identification and backward projection of meaning, which I think, Chris has addressed a lot of changes that are happening in this regard, but it remains a problem. This ignores mutual reinforcement among cognates, and I don't think this always happens, but for example, mirrors, whiteness, water associated with death are going to crop up in a lot of African places, and by the time you get to where I'm talking about, they will have had time to mutually reinforce. But we have, as yet, very few comparative studies of cognates. This slide suggests that round, white, or mirrored faces in burial markers gain scale and three-dimensionality near African American homes. Time doesn't allow me to give you the contextual information on these, but I can tell you that they range from Connecticut on down to western Louisiana, which is the scope of my fieldwork over the years. Photos from the 1930s show Cyrus Bowen's famous grave markers made from twisted wood from an ice storm and also concrete. Around then, American modernists were also reeling at the abstraction of William Edmondson's grave markers, which they quickly recruited into a homegrown counter to European modernism. But what comes through is an independent stream of abstractions with numberless variations, one that European origins can't account for and that requires no Trocadero museum. This abstraction comes through more strongly in ancestors represented by twisted wood and roots, chosen because, quote, it shows God's hand. Cornelius Lee chose two spiraling entwined vines. Edward Houston mounted roots in an enclosed wheel, and the praying tree and ancient poplar down there on this side were both the reasons given for choosing the site of an African American church. A third type of ancestor is an unseen body in a special seat. As Wyatt Yaffe points out, Minkisi lived through networks of practices. Minkisi and the museum are dead. The work by Lonnie Holly, top left, was still alive when I saw it on his property because it was among the flux of life. Gip Packnett tackled the same theme as Holly, so look closely, with the man standing and the woman sitting. At Mr. Packnett's place, they were a performance in which coherence lifts for a moment, then shrinks back into a jumble of visual noise, like the melodic phrases that come up in the improvisational tumult of Albert Eiler's saxophone. Like the other world that they also have footholds in, they're here and they're not, and that is the point. They're also ancestral as a primordial generative couple. Benny Lusain's love seat and chair also enthrone past fathers and mothers with a red paint test tube, a bloodline on the left, and nails pointing up because no one can take their place, and don't try it. Mr. Lusain also showed respect for his ancestors by bringing a large stone from the place that he grew up to this property. His daughter-in-law told me that some nights he would stand in the yard with the lights on and call the names of the family dead. Whites have fought black property ownership with violence and fraud. Vigilantly protected, it's still the best way, or one of the surest ways, to insist on fair treatment in a community. The Lusain and Packnett households were also down home for relatives across the country. While African Americans speak of family, not lineage, the bloodline and the names that Mr. Lusain called at night speak to an enduring sensibility. He and William Winston, whose ancestor area is on screen now, stressed that heads of families must instruct the young and ensure a safe place for them to come back to if trouble strikes. The religious and ethical performances that one of Thompson's consultants called her yard show and one of mine called dressing yard are slower than African masquerades or church services, yet both terms privilege movement. In old-time graveyards, social movement stopped after burial. On the right side, yeah. The plates on these graves were not meant to be moved. Hose on plantation graves for 14 days ensured that the dead stayed put. The words on this cemetery gate read, "Let them rest." But I've tried to show that the life of the ancestors goes on beyond the cemetery.